Darth Malgus was the most dangerous close-range combatant the Sith Empire ever produced, and the legend sources back that claim with a combat record that most Sith Lords across the entire timeline cannot match. Every ability he cultivated, every technique he mastered, and every engagement he survived fed into a single purpose: overwhelming dominance at the point of contact. His physical conditioning, his lightsaber technique, and his command of the Force all pointed forward, into the fight where his power hit hardest. The foundation beneath all of it began with what he had done to his body and the specific Force ability that turned that body into something the Legends materials handled differently from any other Sith warrior on record. Chapter 1. The Physical Foundation. Malgus stood at roughly 2.2 meters tall, well over 7 feet, carrying a frame he had conditioned through decades of relentless physical training that went far beyond what the Sith Empire's largest warriors could match. The Empire had big fighters, yet Malgus was larger than most of them, and had spent more effort building on that size than the source material credits to any of his peers. Size alone, however, was not the separation. What sat on top of the frame was a specific Force ability called Force Rage, and it changed the rules of how he operated under sustained pressure. Force Rage was the dark side's answer to Force Valor, and the difference between the two explains why Malgus became more dangerous the longer a fight lasted, while almost every other fighter in the galaxy became weaker. Force Valor allows a Force user to flood their body with energy and push past their natural physical limits, raising strength, speed, and endurance beyond what the body could normally produce. Force Rage achieved the same result through Fury instead of Focus. It raised strength, speed, toughness, and resolve all at once, and it carried one property that Force Valor did not. It was self-feeding. A Jedi had to maintain deliberate concentration to keep Force Valor running, and that concentration degraded as exhaustion set in. Force Rage drew its fuel from the emotional state of the user, and as long as the anger held, the power held with it. The angrier Malgus became, the more the ability fed itself, and Malgus was always angry. That self-reinforcing loop inverted the normal arc of a prolonged engagement. Where most fighters wore down over time, Malgus escalated. Across a career that spanned nearly the entire Great Galactic War, this meant that every prolonged siege, every grinding campaign, and every drawn-out fight shifted in his favor as the hours passed, because the conditions that exhausted every other fighter on the field were the same conditions that made him stronger. The reason most Sith never reached this level of sustained output was that Force Rage carried a cost that the majority of its users could not survive long enough to overcome. The ability burned through the body's reserves at a rate that matched the power it produced, and for a fighter without the physical conditioning to absorb that drain, the result was collapse rather than escalation. The Legends material records Sith warriors who activated Force Rage in critical moments and gained a temporary advantage. The power became unsustainable. Malgus had built a frame specifically designed to carry that load over hours rather than minutes, and the decades of physical training that preceded his mastery of the ability were not incidental to it. They were the reason it worked for him in a way it did not work for anyone else. The combination was deliberate, and the source material treats it as unique to him within the Old Republic era. What that looked like in practice was a pattern of physical output that the Legends material documents with a consistency that goes beyond individual feats. His strikes carried enough force to fold armored opponents on impact. When he fought Darth Adras, a Sith Lord in full battle armor, a single kick cracked his ribs through the plating. Against Jedi, the novels describe him seizing opponents by the throat, lifting them off their feet, and either closing his grip or driving them into surfaces hard enough to end the fight on contact. That finishing method was a preference rather than a fallback, and the source material records him using it repeatedly against opponents who had personally displeased him, closing his grip not because it was efficient, but because he wanted them to know who was doing it. His durability under Force Rage made wearing him down through sustained pressure almost useless. During the Battle of Alderaan, Republic Commander Jace Malcolm struck him with rockets at close range that engulfed his body in a blinding explosion and scarred his face, and Malgus stood back up. Satele Shan then gathered everything she had and released 2 sequential force blasts, The first pinned him against the face of a cliff, and the second tore the cliff apart and collapsed the rock on top of him. He survived, though his respiratory system was permanently damaged and he wore a mechanical respirator for the rest of his life. His frame was further reinforced with cybernetics following the injuries, yet the damage never reduced his combat ability. He adapted and continued, and the respirator became a fixture on every battlefield that followed. Even in a weakened state, his connection to the Force through rage kept his output beyond what should have been possible. After one engagement left him buried under 2 buildings worth of debris, he pushed the entire mass off himself through raw telekinesis while still recovering, and that kind of output from a fighter who was already injured tells the full story of what the physical foundation meant. Everything else in his arsenal was built on top of it, starting with a lightsaber method that turned that physical advantage into something far more dangerous. Chapter 2: The Lightsaber Method. There were Sith Lords in the Legends timeline whose technical range with a lightsaber exceeded what Malgus could do, yet his approach was built for a specific purpose, and against that purpose, almost no one had an answer. His foundation was Form 5, specifically the Gem So variant, a power attack system designed to overwhelm a guard through sheer mechanical force rather than outmaneuver an opponent through footwork. This was not an unusual choice for a physically powerful fighter, yet what made Malgus unusual was how completely he had stripped the form down to its most destructive elements. Most Gemso users maintained the full range of Form 5 technique, including parries, redirections, and counterstrikes that allowed shifting between offense and defense. Malgus kept the offense and cut away most of the rest so that every exchange was designed to break through whatever was in front of him, and every strike carried enough weight that even a successful block created a problem for the person holding the other blade. The Deceived novel records Aaron Lanier, a trained Jedi Knight, blocking one of his overhead strikes and physically staggering backward on contact, losing ground despite having technically defended herself. The block worked, yet it did not matter, because the force behind the strike turned a successful defense into a losing position. This is the clearest illustration of what made his stripped-down approach viable. The standard counter to a power-heavy offense is a solid guard, and against Malgus, a solid guard bought time without changing the outcome. Stripping away the defensive framework of a lightsaber form should have created openings that a skilled opponent could exploit. Yet the same ability that powered his offense also eliminated the gaps it should have left. Force Rage meant the force behind every strike was already beyond natural limits, so opponents could not easily punish his forward pressure because the strikes came too fast and too heavy to step into safely. The punishment he could absorb meant that hits which would have ended most engagements did not register as meaningful against him, and the Journal of Master Nostaral describes his lightsaber form as containing no gaps worth targeting, written after an engagement requiring the finest available combatants working together. However, the record shows his abilities were not limited to offense. A separate engagement described in the novel shows Malgus moving his blade through a defensive pattern fast enough that it became, in the text's own words, a continuous smear of red light rather than separate movements. He was covering troops on an open battlefield, and not a single blaster bolt made it through, which suggests working knowledge of Form 3, Suresu, though the source material never records him using it in a lightsaber duel. He reserved it for the battlefield, where protecting his soldiers required a different tool than the one he used to destroy individual opponents. The combat record he built under these conditions stands as one of the most complete in Old Republic-era legends, and the names on it carry weight. Jedi Master Ven Zalo had never lost a duel and had cut down Sith in open battle the way a trained soldier moves through fighters who are out of their depth. He was widely considered one of the finest combat practitioners the Order had produced in that generation, and Malgus had become fixated on fighting him. When they first met at the Jedi Temple during the sacking of Coruscant, the Deceived novel does not describe the engagement as one-sided. Zalo pressed him, and for a sustained stretch, the outcome was not present. His technique was clean, his resolve was total, and his record entering the fight suggested he had every reason to expect a victory. Malgus won, and the respect he showed afterward a genuine acknowledgement that the victory had been earned against a worthy opponent, underlines that Zalo had been fighting at full capacity when he fell. That victory matters for the power question because Zalo was not a mid-tier Jedi. He was one of the best the Order had, and he lost to Malgus in a fair engagement. Aaron Lanier, Zalo's former Padawan, engaged Malgus twice and lost both times. In the second engagement, she attempted to use Malgus's lover, Alina Daru, as leverage, which exposed the one emotional weakness he could not suppress. The novel makes clear what that bought her: a few seconds of advantage and a handful of strikes on his body. Malgus converted the pain into fuel through Force Rage, and the rate at which she was losing ground increased after she had landed them. Against Darth Adras in a Sith versus Sith engagement, the gap was not close. Adras attempted Force Lightning as his primary option, and Malgus caught it on his blade with a single motion and sent it back. The novel describes the movement in terms that suggest clearing away something trivial. Adras was operating at full desperation, and Malgus was performing. The ceiling of the record sits at the 1-against-4 engagement against a strike team composed of the greatest heroes of the Great Galactic War. Malgus held that fight for a significant stretch before eventually being captured rather than finished. The hero of Tython, writing afterward, described his lightsaber form as perfect and containing no flaws, an assessment written by someone who had just survived finding that out firsthand. 4 elite combatants working together produce a capture rather than a clean victory, and that tells the story of what Malgus was at the blade. Yet the blade was only one layer of what made him dangerous, and the Force abilities operating behind it worked at a completely different scale. Chapter 3: The Force Arsenal. When Zalo attempted to resist a Force push from Malgus, the result was not a contested exchange. Zalo went through a stone pillar, and the pillar broke around him on impact. His command of the Force was not refined or precise. It was raw power applied at a scale that made precision unnecessary, and the results put him beyond what most Sith Lords of his era could produce. His telekinesis functioned as an extension of the same forward pressure approach that defined his lightsaber work. And the Zalo moment was not an outlier. When the strike team of Great Galactic Civil War heroes engaged him, Malgus opened the fight by descending from a height, driving his hands forward, and sending all 4 of them reeling at once with a single opening move. Against hidden targets, detection and attack merged into one action. The Deceived novel records an ambush where multiple Jedi had taken concealed positions and were actively masking their Force signatures. Malgus felt the faint trace of the light side, pushed past their concealment, located a specific knight, and closed his grip on the knight's throat through the Force before the ambush could begin. On another occasion, when Darth Adras attempted a leaping attack, Malgus plucked him out of the air at the highest point of his jump and drove him into the ground. When he released his rage without directing it at a specific target, the Force repulse that followed was environmental rather than personal. Objects, people, and in at least one recorded case, a ship in a nearby landing position went in every direction at once. Not because the ship was a target, but because it was simply within range when the power left his body. The tactical consequence of that kind of undirected output was that it removed the standard approach to fighting a close-range specialist. The conventional response to a fighter who dominates at short notice is to surround him, force him to divide his attention, and attack from angles he cannot cover simultaneously. The Force repulse made that tactic self-defeating, because the moment multiple opponents closed to striking range was precisely the moment the ability was most likely to activate, and everyone within that radius absorbed the full output at once. The strike team engagement confirmed the problem. 4 elite combatants working together still could not find a formation that denied him the ability to hit all of them at the same time. His Force lightning was dependable across engagements in a way that separated him from users who could produce it, but cannot rely on it under sustained combat pressure. Against single targets, it functioned as a primary offensive tool when the situation called for ranged engagement. Against Darth Adras, it disarmed him and stopped his advance cold without Malgus needing to close distance. Against Aaron Lear's 2 lightsaber defensive stands in the final engagement of the Deceived novel, the lightning drove through her guard, stripped both blades from her hands, and threw her from the shuttle they were fighting on, and the pain was severe enough that she lost consciousness shortly after. Against groups, the output operated at a different scale entirely. During the Jedi Temple assault, Malgus targeted a single Jedi Knight across a chaotic battlefield, and the lightning cut a path through the fighting, ended 2 Padawans who happened to be standing between him and the target, and then reached the Knight and lifted her from her feet. He had aimed for 1 person, and 3 Jedi fell because the output was wide enough to catch everyone in its path, turning a single target ability into an area weapon without deliberate intent. Beyond telekinesis and lighting, Malgus had developed a rare vocal force ability that appears in only a handful of entries across the entire Legends timeline, and at higher output, its results were devastating. The Force Bellow was different from a standard Force Scream in both mechanism and purpose. Where the Force Scream destabilized an enemy's connection to the Force, the Bellow converted the user's voice into direct physical force, and the gap between the two in terms of destructive output was significant. At lower output, Malgus used it to shatter a large stone column and send the fragments tearing through enemy formations. At higher output, aboard his own flagship, the Lindworm, during the retreat from Ord Radama, Malgus released a bellow in a moment of rage that buckled the bridge's viewport, burst the eardrums of every crew member, and produced sound waves powerful enough to overload the fuel cells of an incoming Republic starfighter wave, destroying the entire formation. The Book of Sith records this from Malgus' own journal, and it does not appear in most Sith records because most Sith did not have the Force presence required to produce it. However, raw power without direction is only destruction, and what separated Malgus from the Sith who scorched themselves out was that he understood how to point it. Chapter 4. Power Applied at Scale. During the siege of Ord Radama, Malgus faced a fortified mountain stronghold accessible only through a narrow path swept by enemy fire, and rather than sending infantry forward to absorb the losses, he led the column himself. He and Darth Venimal walked the front of the advance, using their lightsabers to form a continuous defensive screen against incoming fire, while the troops moved behind the cover their blades provided. This was the same Form 3 capability the novel documented in his individual combat record, now scaled from protecting himself to protecting an entire advancing column. When Malgus discovered that the enemy had laid mines along the path, his response demonstrated exactly what his telekinetic power looked like when pointed at a tactical problem rather than a single opponent. He tore a boulder from the mountainside with telekinesis and rolled it ahead of the advance, detonating every mine in the path before a single soldier reached the threat, then flung the same boulder into the enemy's gun positions, clearing the defensive line in a single throw. The same telekinetic ability that had sent Van Zalo through a stone pillar and hurled 4 elite fighters backward was now being used to clear minefields and destroy fortifications. The Book of Sith records these events from Malgus' own journal, and Darth Sidious, annotating the journal thousands of years later, noted the approach with approval, stating that Force users should always lead those without the Force. That Sidious citation carries weight because it was written by someone who had watched Darth Vader operate at full power and still found Malgus' battlefield record worth noting. The distinction Sidious identified was not just raw strength, but the way Malgus applied it to multiply the effectiveness of every soldier around him. His lightsaber defense covered the troops behind him. His telekinesis removed the obstacles they could not survive, and his presence at the front meant the most powerful combatant on the field was also the first one the enemy had to deal with. The practical effect was that engagements which should have stalled at fortified positions ended before the defenders could use their advantage, because the Force abilities that most Sith reserved for personal combat were being applied to the problems that stopped conventional armies. The sacking of Coruscant demonstrated the same principle at an even larger scale. Malgus did not simply participate in the assault on the Jedi Temple, he led the spearhead that breached it, personally cutting through the temple's defenders, while the warriors behind him exploited the gaps his advance created. The assault succeeded because the point of the Imperial formation was a single Sith Lord whose combat output exceeded what the defensive architecture was built to absorb. The defenders who survived the initial breach described the experience as facing a siege weapon that could also fight individual duels, and the speed at which the temple fell reflected the difference between an assault led by infantry and an assault led by Malgus. This pattern of applying personal combat power at the operational level repeated throughout the Great Galactic War, and the results were campaigns that succeeded where standard doctrine predicted failure. They raised the final question, which is where all of this power actually placed him in the Legends hierarchy. Chapter 5: The Ceiling and Legacy. Placing Malgus in the Legends power hierarchy requires looking at what the sources actually document rather than what reputation alone would suggest, and the sources are consistent about both where his ceiling fell and what he achieved beneath it. He was not the most powerful Sith of his era. Vitiate, later known as Valkorion, occupied a tier that does not sit on the same scale. The Old Republic game describes a ritual anathema that consumed every living thing on the planet and stripped the Force from the world permanently, and Vitiate had been operating at that level for over 1,000 years before Malgus was born. A direct confrontation between them would not have been a contest, because Vitiate's power operated at a scope that personal combat ability, no matter how developed, could not answer. Darth Jadis presents a similar problem one tier lower. His Force presence was dense enough that other Force users described it as a change in the atmosphere of a room, and his combat abilities placed him above Malgus based on the available evidence. Yet the tier below those two is where the analysis becomes more useful, and that is where Malgus's record earns its real weight. The comparison that positions Malgus in rough range of Darth Revan has a basis in the record, though the two operated in fundamentally different ways. Revan was exceptional in areas Malgus was not. The combination of light and dark side mastery, strategic intelligence at a galactic scale, and raw Force sensitivity significant enough to draw Vitiate's personal attention across decades. The Legends materials place Revan above Malgus at the peak of both their capabilities, yet the gap was not enormous in the specific area of direct combat. Malgus had taken a narrower set of abilities and pushed them further than Revan's combat record shows in direct engagement, and his Form 5 mastery stands on a level that only a small number of Sith in all of Legends could claim. What makes Malgus more powerful than a power ranking entry is that the sources show he understood exactly where his power worked and where it did not, and he built every engagement around those conditions rather than pretending the limits were not there. The permanent damage he carried from Alderaan proved both the ceiling and the cost. Only someone fighting at Satele Shan's level, able to operate beyond the range where his abilities were strongest, could have achieved that result, and the injury never removed him from a single battlefield afterward. What Satele Shan specifically exploited was the gap that his entire method was built around closing. Malgus was built to end fights at close range, and every ability in his arsenal was designed to get him there and keep him there. Shan recognized that the only way to survive him was to never let him set those conditions, and she used the Force at a distance and scale that kept him outside the range where his advantages applied. The fact that it took a fighter of her caliber, someone who would go on to lead the entire Jedi Order, to find and exploit that gap is itself a measure of how narrow the window was. Within that range, the Legends material does not record anyone who consistently matched what he could do. He defeated Jedi Masters with unbroken records, returned Force lightning to the Sith Lords who sent it, overwhelmed an entire bridge crew with his voice, absorbed damage that should have ended his career, and continued fighting at the same level for every engagement that followed. His weaknesses were real, and they were the inverse of his strengths. Opponents who could engage him from outside his effective range, or who could bring enough coordinated power to deny him the conditions his method required, could find the edges of what he could do. Yet those edges were narrow, and reaching them required resources that most opponents simply did not have. What the full record shows is not just that Malgus was among the strongest Sith the Old Republic produced, but that the way he built his power, by choosing a single direction and refusing to stop pushing, created a fighter that the Legends timeline never produced again. The power Malgus wielded was shaped by the ancient Sith civilization that created the traditions, the techniques, and the dark side philosophy he carried into every battle. And that civilization's history stretches back over 100,000 years. That entire timeline from its earliest origins to its collapse is covered on the channel, and for the complete lineage of Sith masters and apprentices that carried the tradition forward long after Malgus' era ended, that chain from its beginning to its final link is traced in full.